let's pretend today you're now over at the RNC or the NRSC, the NRCC, right? You're running one of those operations and you're talking to your staff and you're talking to members. What do you tell them about the midterms? How are you preparing them for this? How should they be thinking about it?
Well, I think you start with a premise that, in the Trump era of politics, presidential elections have been pretty good for turnout. It's a changed universe of potential voters where you've got basically a swap out, almost a person for person swap out of what used to be a suburban base with a rural and ex-urban base, largely in the center of the country. And during presidential elections, it works out great for you. And in midterms, not so much. And if you think about part of the reason for that is there's probably within a suburban base, you've got somewhere between 73, 78% turnout in a midterm, which is great. And they turn out in the presidentials and everything else. But when you swap that out for a more rural, ex-urban demographic, you're talking about 57. And right. So, much of the success the Republicans had in midterms in 2010, 2014, you relied a lot on those economically facing suburban voters that turned out at a high rate, and Republicans overperformed in midterms. And that's a changed dynamic in this environment. And so I would spend an awful lot of time figuring out how you can mobilize that new base in a midterm that we haven't done in 18, 22, and, maybe 26 is the year.
Yeah. Josh, it's not much different than what Democrats had to deal with in the era of Obama,
exactly.
Right? They said, we're just going to turn out the Obama coalition.
Right.
And guess who the Obama coalition turned out for? Obama. Yeah. And the Trump coalition turns out for Trump.
Yeah.
But it raises sort of a bigger question, though, Josh, because even in the Bush era, the Obama era, et cetera, you're right. You saw these sort of roller coasters between presidential turnout and midterms and results from both of those elections. But there was always a sense that, 2 years, 4 years later, there's going to be a new person as the head of the party, and the coalition would change and evolve with them. But now it feels as if, and I really want to get your opinion on this, the Republican Party is so tied to the image of Donald Trump that when there's no more Donald Trump, how does the party identify itself?
I mean, it's a really good question. And I think there's a lot of people that would come to the conclusion that you just articulated, that you are so identified at this point with MAGA, with Trump, that any other image whatsoever would be extremely difficult to attain. I come at this from a little different perspective. Maybe it's, I don't know, you do this for 25 years and you've seen 4 different iterations of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But then even backing that off and looking historically, through Reagan, Nixon, you can go back to Eisenhower. I've always had a theory that in Republican politics, it's almost impossible to get the nomination surfing a wave that is built by a previous president or a previous movement. You almost always have to capture the imagination of the electorate in a way that gives them something else and something different to think about. I mean, the only exception to that whatsoever, I would argue, is not an exception with George H.W. Bush, when 1,000 points of light looks an awful lot different than a shining city on the hill. And there was a messaging distinction between Ronald Reagan and H.W. Bush. They made 2 very separate candidates, despite the fact that one was a vice president for the other. So, historically speaking, the Republican Party has evolved with a lot of frequency. And if you just look at the last 20 years, I mean, this Republican Party is unrecognizable from the one that you had in the beginning of the beginning of the century here with George H.W. Bush and war on terror and compassionate conservatism and all the rest.
Yeah, though, Josh, there was this, again, when we were growing up in politics, there was this line of Democrats fall in love, Republicans fall in line. And, there's
changed.
the person who's Bob Dole, it was his turn, right? And it was Mitt Romney's turn because, right, this was the right guy in the right place versus the passions of the electorate. And I think Trump really did turn that on its head. And now it's Democrats who seem to be doing the it's time to fall in line, which they did with Biden. And Republicans are like, we're not buying what you're selling, traditional Republican politician. You better you got to repackage and rebrand.
Yeah, well, I think look, Trump has ushered in a new level of authenticity in politics across the board. And I think anybody who's just happened to be in line who reads you their talking points on a day-to-day basis isn't going to get very high up that hierarchy of consideration for voters. And so everything has to have a level of authenticity. But I really do think, whatever happens post-Trump, it is going to be very, very difficult for somebody to just sort of sit on top of it and claim the mantle of MAGA and sort of pretend like they are an heir apparent to a movement that they did not build. I think environments change, political parties change, economy changes, so many different things, not to mention external events, things like 9/11, the financial crisis, COVID. You get a different brand of both political parties that reflect unforeseen events. And I just think that we're constantly evolving and changing. I mean, it's one of the things I love about politics.
Exactly.
It's exactly. You got to figure this stuff out and then get to the root of what the concerns are of voters across the country, both in terms of a primary electorate and a general electorate.
Yep. Well, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We haven't even had the midterms, but so I do want to. And you've been through a lot of these midterm type of elections before, and just again, if thinking about, okay, what would it take to turn out either the Trump base or at least to keep, I guess there are two questions. One is there's the sort of traditional Trump base, and then there are the new people that have become part of the base, right? You talked about rural and exurban, but in 2024, we saw younger voters, we saw urban voters of color, and most specifically, we saw independent voters move over to Trump. That seems like a very different coalition than one that, again, Republicans have been used to working with.
Yeah, I think that the Hispanic, I think the growth within the party in Hispanic and particularly multi-generational Hispanic communities has been a work in progress that has shown real results over a period of time. Obviously, that has come to fruition in a different way under President Trump. But you think about sort of the alignment of party priorities, not just with President Trump, but some more, sort of traditional Republican points of view. It seems like a fit that you could build upon year after year. When you're talking about other communities, Trump, frankly, might just be the guy that can do what other people can't. And I think the trick in a midterm is to try to distinguish between the two. And you've got to ratchet down very specifically to what districts and states are we going for here. This is not a national movement. This is very specific to what it is that build majorities in 2026. And then you take a look at those populations and try to figure out, how many different ways you can skin a cat. Because, one way we always approach these things was if everything goes wrong, if you have a bad economy, if you've got, things that you cannot control that sour and dampen the mood of the Republican Party, what are the 3 or 4 different pathways that can still get you home? And those are the off-year things. Those are the things that you spend an awful lot. I tell you, every single time it comes back to one single starting point, and it's candidate quality. And you've got to make sure that you've got a candidate that can not only articulate a vision that resonates with a state or district, but somebody who's tested enough not to fold and can continue to do that with huge high pressure situations where there's no presidential candidate that blocks out the sun, right? You're on the front line of this deal. And when, the New York Times shows up at your doorstep, they want to talk to you, not everything else. So yeah, candidate quality is where it starts. Then you do a big demographic push. You try to figure out all the various pathways that you can get home.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of those candidates because, Josh, again, if you were over in your old job over at the NRSC and you see Brian Kemp saying no to a run in Georgia, which that is a great pickup opportunity for Republicans there. You had Sununu, another popular former governor, saying no in New Hampshire. What do you think this tells us about the mood right now among potentially really good candidates and how recruiting could line up for this next year?
Well, look, let me start by saying I'm really hesitant to be critical of anybody. I mean, this was my job for 15 years, right? And so, Senate Republicans in particular have got a very unique circumstance in that this is the first real turnover that they've had since 2007 in the campaign apparatus and how it's operated. And there was a lot of lessons learned from us before we got to a point where we're consistently winning Senate races and majorities and everything else. And so, some of these lessons have to be learned the hard way. And there's no absolute right way to do things. But I always thought that the most important thing in an election, you can talk about the money, it's very, very important, but you also can build in various plans to do that in an election year where you are comparable as long as you're laying the infrastructure correctly. What you can't do is restart party alignment in the on year. Like, you've got to start in the off year, and that goes with finding all the opportunities and then making sure that you've got alignment with leaders within the Republican Party, the White House, local leaders about candidates, and trying to disarm a bomb that is a potential primary that could take valuable resources out of a general election, and try to do that as quickly as you possibly can. So you've got, by the end of the summer of the off year, you've got at least the makings of a slate of 3 or 4 really good opportunities that you're going to be able to rely on when all hell comes raining down the next year. I don't think they're there yet, and I think part of that is you've got a new administration that has an awful lot to do on their agenda, both foreign and domestic, and a Congress with very thin majorities that is trying their very best to try to figure out how to do the official side duties. And so the politics right after you win an election don't seem like a top priority. I think what I learned in doing it is it has to be. You've got to figure that stuff out. And, if you look at like Texas, that's a real disappointment. That to me is something that could have been avoided with Senator Cornyn.
The disappointment being that there's a primary against a sitting incumbent. Is that what
feels
Ken
like
Paxton taking on Cornyn? Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like a bomb that should have been disarmed before we got there. I'm not saying that it is not going to be, it just gets more difficult after people file paperwork. Kemp is sort of a unique situation in that he's a unicorn and he knows it. Is the guy who's an incredible, sophisticated political operator who's not in love with tying their own political fortunes to things that they cannot control. So that was always going to be a tough recruitment process. I think it was made more difficult by economic environments and all kinds of, highlighting what his core concern would be, and that I don't have my hands on the wheel of ultimately how people perceive the environment or my candidacy. And so, look, things could change. I've seen cycles where you get into a fall and somebody completely changes their mind about something. I mean, remember
Marco Rubio, right?
Remember?
He said, I'm not running, and then jumped in again at the last minute. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were several that we just kept working on. I mean, Cory Gardner in Colorado said no publicly about 3 times before we ultimately got him into that race in 2014, which is a real game changer. It allowed us to spread the map and have the capacity of winning double-digit Senate seats, which is not typically done on the Republican side. So I don't know if that's a done deal or not. Clearly, you would have loved to have had Kemp. We'll see. Georgia's still got to be a huge pickup opportunity. Republicans need to focus on that. But there are all of these things that feel like they need to be sewed up, right? And they can only be sewed up with alignment within the party. The good news for Republicans is it's an awful lot easier to do that in a shorter timetable when you have the White House than when you don't. I mean, my entryway into politics, Amy, was in 2002 when then Vice President Cheney called Tim Pawlenty and told him, "You're not running for Senate, you're running for
I
governor," and
remember
told
that.
Norm Coleman the vice versa. And, that was my first campaign. But that's what the White House has the capability of doing, knowing that there's huge amounts of political SWAT that is associated with it, that can clean things up a little quick. So I don't think look, this is not a problem that is existential at this point, but they're going to have to make some progress on that.
Right. I mean, the thing to me in Georgia, Josh, is it's one thing for Brian Kemp to say no. It's another thing for, say, Donald Trump to endorse Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this bedeviled Senate races in particular. I mean, this is Senate races for, unless you do this for a living, it's hard to communicate how different they are than House races, governor's races, or anything on the state and local level. They're miniature presidential campaigns.
Yeah.
I mean, people get to know these people inside and out. I mean, every flaw, every asset. I mean, there is $100 million being spent in your state if you have anything remotely competitive. And so you've got to have a tested candidate. You got to have somebody. And you've seen, circumstances where we have 22 is the latest, the midterm, where you've got candidates that couldn't get it done.